Chapter 21. Rain. The day of the performance was a day of rest. The decree went forth from Paul that the actors were not even so much as to say their lines over to themselves. This was adopted directly from his father's methods. Mr. Gildersleeve thought it imperative for his actors to come to their work on the night of the premiere fresh. A break of a few hours when their minds were taken up with something entirely foreign and different, assured for them better and truer work, he insisted. And now Paul. But it is rather difficult, especially if this is the first time you have ever acted in your life, and the whole affair means as much to you as this affair certainly did mean to Crystal. Whatever was she to do with herself and the day, the long day that stretched away before her, a path to the fateful evening? It was very well for Paul to tell them not to think their lines, but he should have told them how not to think their lines. Crystal would have obeyed if she could. Alexander Coldwater's imagination was at work for Crystal, however, and before breakfast was over at Tinkle Bell, the telephone rang. Selina answered. "Hold the line a minute, and I will ask her," Crystal heard Selina say, after she had listened a few seconds at the receiver. It was Alexander, inviting them both, Selina and Crystal, to squeeze into his one-seated roadster and motor to Sunderland, a summer resort where there were good hotels for luncheon and surf bathing. They could take their bathing things and dress in the hotel, but Crystal, to Selina's surprise, did not want to go. The real reason was that she was ashamed that Alexander had seen her cry yesterday at the beach, and after a night of broken sleep, when the memory of her humiliation had returned numberless times, she could not face him. Crystal had said the truth when she told Alexander that she was not a crying girl. She had cried when her grandmother died. She had cried several months ago when she had quarreled about nothing, with Selina, and Selina had gone to her bedroom and locked her door. Except for that, she had not cried since her childhood. Those 2 times, Selina was the only soul to know about her tears and witness them. That was just barely to be borne. But that Alexander had seen her and heard her. No, she didn't want to go to Sunderland. Selina made some excuse to him, and that way of escape from the difficulties of the day was closed. Selina did not understand Crystal's distaste for Alexander's company, because Crystal had told her nothing of the events of yesterday. So she found an explanation for herself now, and spoke it. "I think it is silly of you," she said, "just because you don't like the idea of going to Miss Putnam's boarding school, to take it out on that young man. It wasn't his suggestion." "I'm not taking it out on him, and I'm not so down on the idea as you think, especially since I've lost the chance of getting Mr. Gildersleeve's attention by my acting of the nurse. I sort of planned, Selina, how it was to be. He was going to see that I could act and give me a chance right away, so I wouldn't even have to finish high school. But now it won't happen, and I might as well be in Miss Putnam's school as anywhere. Only I don't think Miss Grant will like the idea much. She may tell Miss Putnam I want to be an actress, and then she won't take me. Agnes said once that Miss Putnam wouldn't let one of her girls talk the way I talk about the stage and acting. Crystal sighed. But I won't have to talk. I can keep it inside. You may outgrow it, Selina comforted. It may be, as Miss Grant says, just a phase. Madame Coldwater thought that too. After you'd gone, we were talking about you, and she said that you'd probably outgrow it. And of course, you have to finish school. You don't want to be uneducated, do you? If I went around the world with Victoria Gildersleeve and studied foreign languages and read and learned all her plays by heart, I think that would be a better education than I could ever get in any school. Don't you? Selina could not help laughing, though she knew very well that Crystal was serious. Is that what you thought Mr. Gildersleeve would ask you to do after seeing you act the nurse? She asked. I thought he might. Stranger things must be happening all the while in the world. I thought I might understudy and have little bits of tiny parts. I almost felt as though it was going to happen. I told Hebe. She didn't laugh. She simply said, I couldn't leave you alone, could I? But now that would be all right. You're going to be having a grand, glorious time, a perfect time in Boston, and you'll find a husband that is worthy of you, a man who is doing something big and fine in the world. You will have all those 6 children and run a lovely house, and... But Selina leaned across the little breakfast table and clapped her hand over her sister's mouth. Crystal Barker, what a horrid child you are. Find a husband. You make me not want to have a season at all. Do you think that is what it means, a Boston season of parties and things? Of course that's what it means. Why shouldn't it? Why pretend it doesn't? It is just giving you your chance to do the thing you have genius for, loving people and taking care of them and making the world lovely. For you, it's the very same kind of a chance that going around the world on this trip with Victoria Gildersleeve would be for me. Selina stared at Crystal. You are the funniest, she exclaimed finally. And my dear, what a dreamer. I've got another dream. For heaven's sake, what is it? I feel sure, really and truly sure, that Victoria Gildersleeve herself is going to be at the play tonight. Why do you think that? I don't think it. I know it, with a funny, trembling kind of knowing. That day she was supposed to come on the train, and then Miss Grant came along and said she wasn't coming. Well, even then I felt this same way, that she would get off the train, in spite of Miss Grant. She didn't, of course, so I may be wrong again, but I can't help thinking she will, just the same. I wouldn't be surprised myself if she did appear tonight. Selina at last found something to agree on with Crystal. I do think she is a queer mother, when Paul has been so hurt, and they are having the play and everything, not to come. Madame Coldwater said that she had the information from a person who certainly knew that Victoria is in this country, and probably even in New England. So how can she help coming? But the next instant, Victoria Gildersleeve was forgotten, and the two girls looked at each other, dismayed. The sunshine had vanished from the silver coffee pot, and Selina's honey-colored hair, a fan of shadow, lay over the room. Then it thundered, distant thunder, but distinct and purposeful. "Oh, it's never going to rain," Selina exclaimed. They went out to the back door and stood on the sundial path, surveying the sky. The day that had dawned cloudless and perfect was now distinctly threatening. The gray was fast eating up the blue in the sky. "Oh, it's probably only a shower, and will merely cool the air, and really be an advantage," Selina spoke optimistically. "I hope Hilda's got the sets under cover. She had canvas to spread over the chairs in case of rain, and save the bother of taking them all in." Crystal tried to be optimistic too, but of course, rain today, at least rain tonight, was the one thing to be dreaded. It would simply necessitate the plays being postponed, and that would mean that Mr. Gildersleeve would never see it. The girls strolled down the sundial path, studying the sky, all the four corners of the sky. The storm was coming up very fast. The air was almost stifling in spite of the sun's having disappeared in the dark on-hurrying clouds. Selina fanned herself with her handkerchief. The thunder rumbled all around the horizon. "It sounds like a great wounded and dying octopus," Crystal said. Selina laughed. "You have heard so many wounded and dying octopuses," she observed. They had come now to the foot of the garden, and stood looking out across the fields. Suddenly Selina clutched Crystal's arm. "Look, look," she cried. There was no need to point, however, for Crystal had seen it as soon as Selina. It was the storm coming toward them across the fields. A high wall of slanting, silvery rain, a wall reaching as high as their eyes could follow it up into the sky, was sweeping, rushing toward them. They stood transfixed, but the high, silvery wall drove forward directly on Tinker Bell. When it reached the stream, perhaps 50 yards away from where the girls were standing, it became terrifying to them. They gave the wonder one last glance, and turned and ran for very life, they felt, toward the house. It was the height and splendor of the rain wall that frightened them, not the rain itself. As they reached the door, the wall overtook them, overlapped them. It was as though a harsh but playful hand, a giant hand of course, had slapped their backs. Then they were inside, laughing, and suddenly hilarious, for as they ran, the air had cooled. They had run through sharp, bright wind. All the stuffiness was being pushed out of the day by that glittering wall of silver rain. It was passing over the house now. They pictured it sweeping on across Fairfleet, moving up Long Hill and across the valley to the hazy mountains. It left Tinklebell standing in a great steady downpour of rain, and the rooms were dark, darker than twilight. But someone else besides themselves had come running with them toward the door, and stood now sheltered in the kitchen. The someone else was laughing too. For one fleet instant, Crystal was convinced that it was a spirit of the silver rain. Perhaps that wall had been made up of spirits, and this one had got caught by the open doorway, and so could not sweep on with the others. The kitchen was cool and swirly with bright wind. The very dusk that the blackened sky cast seemed to have a swirl of silver lining. Crystal stopped, laughing to look for the rain spirit. Selina stopped too, and they turned together to survey the being they had both sensed. It was Hebe, her back like their own, drenched from the rain's great slap, elated laughing, but she sobered at once and changed. She looked rather shy, and her eyes asked a question of Crystal that Crystal could not understand. She was not so different from the rain sprite she might have been. She had a bundle under her arm, and she tossed it down on the kitchen table at her hand now. "It's some stuff for a new cloak for Romeo," she said nonchalantly. "I thought you and I, Selina, between us, ought to be able to do something about it. I came by the fields, and the rain chased me. I never had a better race in my life." "Did you see the tall wall of rain?" Crystal asked. "No, but I felt it, and I heard it. I ran with all my might, not taking time to look around." But though she had run with all her might, Hebe was not breathless, and her cheeks were as pearly pale as ever. She might have been sitting still in a chair for the last 30 seconds, for all the evidence one saw in her of recent exertion. "She is a rain spirit," Crystal explained it to herself. Of course it meant nothing to her, that chase. Selina and Crystal were panting and flushed and exhilarated. They were so exhilarated that they were forgetting the open windows. It was the rain spirit who reminded them, and then all three flew to close those where it was raining in. This was only the second time Selina had seen Hebe, and the first time Hebe had been inside Tinklebell, yet Selina treated her as an intimate. She did not think of apologizing for the unmade beds when they were upstairs closing windows, or the table with the breakfast dishes still on it in the dining room, and when Hebe wanted to help with the work so that they might get to Romeo's cloak the quicker, Selina accepted her help easily, almost as a matter of course. The three did everything together. They spread up beds, tidied the house, washed the dishes, and even went to the door at the same time to look speculatively at the weather. It amused Selina that Hebe was so very much like Crystal in the way she did things, though if comparisons were to be drawn, Crystal was more efficient than Hebe. Hebe behaved just exactly as though she had never had a dish towel in her hands before. "You'll find I'm the same way when it comes to sewing Romeo's costume," Hebe warned them ruefully. "You'll probably have to do most of the work, Selina, but I can cut the thing and drape it well enough. The fact is that I have had a peculiar life. It has just happened that I have never had an opportunity to do housework or sewing or even the simplest kind. If Miss Grant had only been there, how she would have seized upon the occasion for sarcasms. Surely all summer she would have pointed out for weeks and weeks the opportunity had been Hebe's to learn something about housework, if she had only cared to help her friend Bianca, and for days past what had been staring her in the face, if it wasn't an opportunity for sewing. Strangely, these considerations did not enter the girls' minds. To them, Hebe herself was more real than the obvious. The obvious faded in her presence as though melted by truth, which was sounder and brighter. Although Hebe had seen Selina only that once before in the arbor, she realized a difference in her now. Something had happened, something that gave Selina's face and eyes and voice an expectant note and a delighted one. Before the work was half done, Selina had told her what it was without her asking at all. This was rather extraordinary behavior in Selina, for as yet not even Miss Grant knew, but it did not surprise Crystal. No effect that he might have, so long as it was a good and a marvelous effect, would surprise Crystal. "A season in Boston," Hebe exclaimed. Then she looked at Crystal. Crystal was putting the dishes away on the pantry shelves as Hebe handed them to her through the slide. Hebe's look said, "Then you would be free to go with the Gildersleeves on the world tour." Something so definite, even without words, had passed between the two that Crystal said, as though answering a direct statement of Hebe's, "I can never do Romeo so well as that. There hasn't been time enough. He'll never notice me." She meant Mr. Gildersleeve. The housework did not take much over an hour, and it went gaily. Ordinarily, Selina had to know a person for a long while before she lost her reserve and a certain aloof coolness, but she treated Hebe like a sister, an older sister returned from a long absence. She herself seemed younger and more hesitant. Tinkle Bell was musical. There was the rain on the shingles outside, and inside hurrying light feet and lighter laughter. The dusk of the little house, still in the storm, held swirls of silver. Was it their laughter? Was it light from shifting clouds? Was it Hebe's magic? They went up to Selina's room to make the new cape. "Are you sure Miss Grant won't mind?" Selina asked. "I understand she decided the one we have would do." "Well, if she minds, or if Paul minds, Crystal can wear the other. Only let's make this one so beautiful there'll be no choice. They'll have to like it." Hebe opened her bundle on Selina's bed. A book caught Crystal's eye first. A book in a fresh, gaudy cover. She picked it up and saw stated on the jacket that it was a mystery story for girls. It must be a book of Hilda's. Hilda reveled in mystery stories for girls, and this one was by her favorite author. "That is for you, Crystal," Hebe said. "When we've got the cape started, then you're going into your own room, curl up in a dressing gown, and read this until you get sleepy." Crystal laughed at the idea. Sleepy today, the day of the performance, and with Hebe in the house, and Selina laughing every other breath, and the swirls of silver. When the girls saw what material Hebe had brought for the cape, they protested. It was Hebe's white dressing gown that she meant to sacrifice. Selina picked it up and looked at it with delight. "What lovely material!" she exclaimed. "Is it wool? But how fine, how exquisite!" She held out a long, straight sleeve. "Oh, we're never to touch this, Hebe," she cried in real concern. But Hebe was firm. She thought Romeo should have a white cloak, and here this was to line it. She unfolded a very long and wide scarf of blue silk, embroidered with silver lilies. The girls held their breath, it was so beautiful. "It is larkspur blue," Crystal whispered. The loveliness of the thing made her whisper, "Oh, it must never, never be used for a lining." Selina bent and looked at the embroidery closely. "It is done by hand," she stated. "Why, it's the most exquisite thing. If Miss Grant had been present, it is certain she would have made Hebe prove the possession her own. The most casual glance proclaimed it costly and rare. The girls were dismayed at the idea of cutting it, but Hebe did not listen to them. Half an hour sufficed to cut and drape the new cloak for Romeo. Now for the actual sewing. Hebe said and sighed. "Oh, that's nothing." Selina was confident of her own powers for the rest. "But how you ever pinned it to look like this, how you ever imagined how it was going to be, and then made it so with shears and pins, well, it is beyond me. You never need to sew, Hebe, when you can create such wonders. Let dull people like me stitch." Crystal turned around and around for their inspection. When she moved an arm, the silver lilies, against their blue background, gleamed and shimmered. The white, light wool fell from her shoulders in soft, deep folds. It was a lovely garment, a garment for romance and moonlight. Now that Crystal was no longer needed, Hebe returned to the idea of rest, book, and finally sleep for her. "Why, it isn't 11 o'clock yet," Crystal protested. "How can you expect me to need rest right in the middle of the morning?" But Hebe had an argument to win her. "All wise actresses do rest before a first night," she said. "Come, and I will show you what a real actress, a professional, would do if she were you." It ended in Crystal's being propped up with pillows, 2 from Selina's bed, and her own one, in nightgown and bed jacket, under a light cover, the girl's mystery story in her hands, and a glass of milk and a bread and butter sandwich at her elbow on the bedside table. "Read the story until you are sleepy," Hebe advised, "then drink the milk and eat the bread and butter. Push the pillows over to the other side of the bed and sleep." She went out with Selina and closed the door. The wind was from the other side of Tinkle Bell, and so Crystal's windows could be open. The steady downpour of the rain made a monotonous slishing sound in the leaves of the maples. The room was cool and airy. The opening paragraph of the book arrested her attention. It was the first time in her life she had ever even looked into such a book. It was a very good story of its kind, well written, bursting with suspense and excitement. At first, before she got well into the story, Crystal would stop between pages to worry about the rain. Would the weather clear in time for the performance? It did seem to be lightening a little. The cloak was certainly lovely. Selina and Hebe were chattering as they worked on it. Crystal heard their low voices and subdued laughter, in spite of the 2 doors closed between. Then the book took her. It divided her from even the memory of the play. It cut her off. She read it straight through to the end. But long before she reached the end, it had done for her exactly what Hebe had hoped it would do. It had broken the continuity of her thinking and her feeling. Hebe had selected the book with utmost care, and now the story ended, the covers closed. Crystal was sleepy. At least she wanted to shut her eyes and follow the girl heroine all over again, in memory this time, through her adventures. Dutifully, she ate the bread and butter and drank the milk. Then she pushed away the pillows, turned on her side, and was fast asleep in less time than it takes to tell. And Hebe's miracle not only worked, but it held. Crystal slept long and dreamlessly. As she slept, the day cleared. Sunshine poured in at the windows at the other side of the house. They were opened again to let in the fresh rain-washed air with the sunshine. Selina and Hebe lunched together from the kitchen, hastily but adequately. Then they stole back upstairs to finish their work on the romantic cloak. Chapter 22. The Second Offering. You might be a professional, Miss Barker, the way you controlled the muscles around your eyes. Please show yourself to Miss Grant now to see if you'll do. The make-up man was a professional himself, hired from Boston for the occasion. His praise was sweet to Crystal's ears. The night was a perfect one, still, starry, and not too warm. The audience was already gathering, and in 20 minutes, or a little more, Hilda would give the signal for the water curtain to spread its opal fan before the stage. Alexander's sets for the public place would be moved into position, and Samson and Gregory would take their stand with swords and bucklers ready to appear. Then the fan would fade, and the play begin. Everything behind the scenes was hurry and excitement. Crystal, running to find Miss Grant in the dressing room, met Agnes, dressed and made up for her first scene on the stairs. She stopped and gazed at her ecstatic. Agnes was wearing her hair after Alexander's watercolor design for it. It fell in big, light curls all about her shoulders, bound on her forehead with a chaplet of flowers. Her frock was pink and fluffy, and bedecked with festons of rosebuds of a deeper pink. Her feet were cased in white satin, heelless pumps, and across her shoulders lay a gauzy scarf, colored like the dawn. "Oh, you are too lovely for any words," Crystal exclaimed, with unfeigned rapture. "And too scared for any words," Agnes responded. "Plays at Miss Putnam's were never like this. I never got scared there, never. But this is why. It's professional. These expensive costumes, the lights, Paul's behaving so seriously, and the make-up man. As for Crystal, it was her first experience, and she had nothing to compare it with. Her own scare had not yet set in, and so she could give her complete attention and admiration to the vision above her there on the stairs. For a flashing instant, she remembered that it might have been herself, if only she hadn't been frightened the afternoon of the tryouts. Then she put that memory aside. Never, never could she have made the lovely Juliet that Agnes now made. She said, scarcely realizing she was speaking at all, and straight from her heart, "I'm glad you're doing Juliet, Agnes. Good luck." Agnes descended to Crystal's own stair. "I'm glad you're doing Romeo," she whispered mischievously in reply. Paul was so passionate. His fiery acting would be just the last straw tonight. "Don't you get fiery, Crystal?" "Wasn't I fiery at dress rehearsal?" Crystal asked, concerned. "Not like Paul, of course. No, I could remember who you were all the time, Crystal Barker. Just Crystal Barker. That will be a comfort tonight." But it was no comfort to Crystal. Oh dear, she sighed inwardly. But before the sigh had quite dissolved, intention had rushed in to take its place. "It won't be that way tonight," she assured the trusting Agnes. "I shall be Romeo. I shall. "For goodness sakes, don't go off like that," Agnes protested, still with lowered voice, for there was much coming and going in the hall and even up and down the stairs past them. "You aren't a Roman candle, or are you?" And then, as though Crystal's Roman candle propensities had reminded Agnes of Crystal's queer friend Hebe, she asked, "Say, my dear, what do you think about Hebe's having torn up that letter? I guess you've changed your mind about her, haven't you?" Now Crystal knew why Hebe had looked at her so many times at Tinkle Bell this morning with a question in her eyes. Hebe, too, wondered whether she had changed her mind about her. And Crystal, it was the absolute truth. Crystal had entirely forgotten about the torn letter, or rather she had only remembered it as a background for her humiliation that Alexander had seen her tears. No slightest doubt of Hebe had lingered. She answered now quickly, "No, I shall never change my mind about Hebe. She is wonderful." "Yes, and that's about the millionth time you've said so. Mother's going to tell Mr. Gildersleeve about the letter tonight." "Is she?" Crystal was unperturbed. She remembered Hebe, a sprite out of the silvery rain, with a question in her eyes. It was not a guilty Hebe. She was as crystalline as the rain. "Yes, she is, and Mother doesn't blame you a bit, not a bit. And I say, Crystal, are you going to school with us this fall? Mother said perhaps you might. Madame Coldwater told Mother she'd advised Selina to send you. Is it true she's invited Selina to spend the whole winter with her? Isn't it just too marvelous?" Miss Grant herself looked down from the landing at that minute. "Good evening, Crystal," she called. "This is my first glimpse of you. You're already made up? Good. Come along and let me see you. Up in the dressing room, Crystal unfolded the white wool cape, lined with the silver embroidered blue. Hebe had extracted a promise from Crystal and Selina that they would not disclose her part in it. So now Crystal mumbled something about Selina having made it. Of course she had made it, Selina, but without Hebe. For all that, the creation would never have been. Miss Grant gazed, entranced by the exquisiteness of it. Crystal clasped it at her shoulder and let it fall over her yellow doublet. It hung on her tall, slight figure like a garment of a prince. With her bobbed hair, her eyes, due to the skill of the makeup expert, looking extraordinarily large and brilliant. Her brows, straighter and darker than they were by nature, and draped in the romantic cloak. Crystal made a very acceptable Romeo. The femininity that had worried Paul no longer existed, nor could one say masculinity had taken its place. She was sexless, a creature of romance and poetry. Miss Grant was more than satisfied. But this lovely thing, she said, touching the cloak, lifting it to look at the embroidered flowers, stroking its texture. Where did Selina ever get such material? It is unbelievably lovely. Fortunately, Crystal had no need to answer, for Hilda burst into the room with questions and exclamations. Others followed her for Miss Grant's approval of their makeup, and the room was hubbub and confusion. At 3 minutes before time for the curtain signal, Mr. Gildersleeve had not yet arrived. Paul, already comfortably ensconced in a big chair, with a foot-rest and numerous pillows in the wings, where he could both see everything that went on the stage, and prompt, was much concerned. And Hilda was concerned. "You'll wait for him, Paul," she begged. "The car must have broken down, or a tire burst, or something. He'll surely get here, only we may have to wait a little." But Paul said, indeed, they would not wait. The play was announced to begin at 8:15, and it should begin on the minute. He hoped he was professional enough for that. A whole performance could not be held up for one spectator, even if that spectator was Claude Gildersleeve himself. Certainly they would begin on time. Oh dear, if he'd only planned to come by train. This always happens with automobiles, Hilda wailed. "Don't fuss," Paul answered her calmly. "I dare say he'll get here, busted tire or what. Father has a way of getting places, you know. Anyway, be ready to give the signal in 1 minute and a quarter." Paul had his watch in hand. Meanwhile, Agnes and Crystal were on their knees at a darkened window above, looking down at the audience. Electric light bulbs were strung above the 2 aisles, and so the audience was almost as well lighted as one in a regular theater. Madame Coldwater was just coming in. She was wearing an opera cloak of brilliant blue, her silvery head marcelled and dressed high with a wide pearl comb, fan-like above it, reminded Crystal of her own silvery flowers embroidered against their blue. She was ushered to a seat in the middle of the 3rd row and given her stub. Everything was being done in order. Beside her, a chair was still vacant. That was for Alexander, Crystal knew. For the minute he was helping the stage hands, but he would be in his chair for the opening lines. Miss Grant had already slipped out and taken her place. She occupied the chair on the other side of Madame Coldwater, and beside her was Selina. Selina in her party dress of green chiffon, wrapped around with a lacy scarf. Everyone else was there too, apparently. There was no chair, empty except that extremely comfortable one in the very first row, reserved for Claude Gildersleeve. But where was Hebe? Crystal had taken it for granted that she would see the play, ever since she had helped with the making of the cloak. She had not even bothered to ask her, she had been so sure. But now she looked in vain. There were all the mothers of everybody in the cast, the fathers, and all the summer people, and there were a few permanent residents of Fairfleet, all who had shown any interest whatever in the production. Conspicuous among them sat the postmistress with old John Hankins, her uncle. The old gardener tonight was in his Sunday black, a pink of his own growing in his buttonhole. His was as eager a face as any there present. It might well be. He had read Romeo and Juliet, lent to him by Crystal, last night for the first time in his life, sat up far into the night to finish it. He thought there was a lot in this Shakespeare, and if Crystal would lend him some more of her books, he meant to read them right off, every one on top of the other, at the price of untold sleep. He felt indeed that for him, since his initiation into Shakespeare, life had begun all over. He leaned forward, his hands on his knees, waiting to see this Romeo in the flesh. It was this sight of old John Hankins' eagerness that caused Crystal her first stabs of stage fright this night. Madame Coldwater looked amiably skeptical. Miss Grant was flushed and pleased. Crystal read in her face the remarks she had been making for weeks past. This is all splendid for these young people. It will do more for them than a year in school, I do believe. It is making a permanent addition to the aesthetic side of their natures. Shakespeare has become a very part of them. Alexander, when he took his place beside his grandmother, would sit idly leaning against his chair back, his legs sprawled, his hands in the pockets of his dinner jacket, his smoky blue eyes enigmatical. Crystal could see him as plainly as though he were already there, remembering how she had doubled up and cried horridly and noisily in the presence of those enigmatical eyes. She flushed now hotly beneath her grease paint. Dr. Grant, at Selina's left, looked more tired and worn than usual, but his face held kindliness. Whatever the quality of the performance, his expression would remain kind and untouched, save by human considerations. Selina was tranquil. She had faith in Crystal, and that was what her posture and face expressed now, happy faith and expectation. Yes, It was old John Hankins, eager and excited, that stirred Crystal, kneeling in the dark with Agnes at that upper window, to press her hand to her doublet, where she felt her heart hammering. It was old John Hankins she had to convince. Could she? There would be her test. And there was one other to convince, but his chair was empty now, the only empty chair in the house. If he did get here after all, as Paul confidently prophesied he would, then it was those two, Mr. Claude Gildersleeve, the famous producer, and Mr. John Hankins, the competent gardener, for whom Crystal must act. She still searched for Hebe. All up one aisle of chairs her hungry glance traveled, and down the other. She discovered Bianca first. She was sitting beyond Madame Coldwater, in the same row, but in the shadow of a clump of white lilacs. That was why Crystal had not spotted her sooner. All the rest of the audience was in bright light. Only Bianca and her companion sat in shadow. Bianca was in black silk, her face somber and cameo-like in its lack of expression. Her companion was Hebe, of course. Crystal rejoiced that she had found her, and that she was there. Hebe was wrapped in something dark, shadowy. Only her pale face and throat shone in the dark. The something dark was a violet wool cape, the color of evening. Crystal had expected to rejoice when she found her friend in the audience, and she did rejoice, but there was more than that to it. Her heart, that had been wildly beating because of old John Hankins and that empty chair, grew still as though touched by a supernatural hand. What was Hebe going to think of her acting of the play? She remembered how Hebe had given her Romeo's lines that day in her little room across the narrow bridge. Hebe had known the part perfectly. Her voice had been toneless and very low. Crystal had thought it toneless, at least, listening to it in her own pauses. But now, in memory, it was not toneless. It rose in her mind like a forgotten music. I have night's cloak to hide me from their eyes. By love, that first did prompt me to inquire, he lent me counsel, and I lent him eyes. I am no pilot, yet, wert thou as far as that vast shore washed with the farthest sea, I would adventure for such merchandise. Sleep dwell upon thine eyes, peace in thy breast. Would I were sleep and peace, so sweet to rest. Oh yes, it still was true, old John Hankins and the great producer, who might at any minute take the empty chair there in the middle of the front row, were her critics. She stood or fell by their decision. But to her friend Hebe, sitting over there, with night's cloak, to hide me from their eyes, Crystal would give her acting, a gift for Hebe. Whatever Crystal did with the part, and now she was sure it would be a good thing, she would do with it, since it was to have such a destiny. Crystal offered it in her heart to her friend. The larkspurs had been her first offering to that friend. Her acting tonight was to be the second offering. At that instant, the water curtain rose, blotting the audience away from the sight of the girls at the window. Opal, iridescent, otherworldly in its color and loveliness. When it fell, the stage below would be prepared for the entrance of Samson and Gregory. The play would begin. Chapter 23. Hebe Discovered. At the end of the first act, that vacant chair was still vacant, but aside from that, victory was in the air, its bright wings spread over everything. In spite of the absence of his father, Paul was jubilant. The actors had done their parts with true regard to all in which he had coached them. Mercutio, in particular, was to be commended. The audience was calling for him now, clapping and calling his name, along with Juliet's, beyond the water curtain. The excitement of the audience, of those more than 100 people, out there beyond the water curtain, had communicated itself to the actors. They fairly danced now behind the closed shutters of the drawing room, and embraced one another ecstatically as the applause rose to as much of an uproar as so well-bred an audience might allow itself. Hilda gave the signal, and the curtain died away before the rainbow of its coloring was quite lost on the air. Juliet and Mercutio stood bowing to each other, and then to the audience. Soon, in response to the ever-increasing applause, everyone else who had appeared in the first act joined them. Then the curtain rose again, and they scurried away to their dressing rooms. Miss Grant turned to Madame Coldwater. She uttered almost the identical phrases Crystal had read on her face from the upper window. Madame Coldwater agreed, but she added, "I think it's a shame Mr. Gildersleeve couldn't manage to get here in time, and I had a feeling that Victoria herself might come after all. It is all rather disappointing, after the young people have worked so hard and are really doing so extraordinarily well." Dr. Grant put his hand for an instant on Selina's, lying on her chair arm at his side. "That little sister of yours," he said, smiling, "makes a very acceptable Romeo. It's a difficult undertaking, that of a girl playing a man's part." "Agnes is beautiful," Selina complimented him, in her turn, "and what quality her voice has." For the minute, Dr. Grant's tired look had vanished. He seemed younger and happier. "Isn't she lovely?" he agreed. "I hadn't realized what a lot of work the children had been up to, and what had been accomplished." Old John Hankins sat still, bent forward, hands on knees. He was muttering something under his breath, but his niece, the postmistress, did not catch just what. The faded pink in his buttonhole might have been having a second incarnation in his bronzed old cheeks, so tinted they were with excitement. Bianca spoke in low, rapid sentences to her friend Hebe. Hebe responded with a nod only. Miss Grant and Madame Coldwater were both looking in the direction of the two. Madame Coldwater, through her lifted lorgnette, with unfeigned curiosity, Miss Grant with unconcealed contempt. Just as the water curtain was fading for the second act, a man in an opera cape and with an opera hat crushed under his arm came around the red house. Every one had been talking with such animation that they had failed to notice the sound of the arrival of Mr. Gildersleeve's car. So he approached unobserved. He paused at the back of the last row of spectators and stood through the scene, not taking time or bother to look for his chair. By the time he had established himself and taken in the lighting effects, the arrangement of the stage, and the number of the audience, Crystal as Romeo was proclaiming, "He jest at scars that never felt a wound, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun." From that instant, the great man forgot the lighting effects, forgot the audience. A new light had certainly broken for him, and though it had not quite the radiance of the sun, it had radiance enough to keep him standing very nearly immobile in the dew of the lawn through a whole scene of an amateur performance of Romeo and Juliet, and it kept him immobile even some seconds after Romeo's last words had faded on the air. "Sleep dwell upon thine eyes, peace in thy breast. Would I were sleep and peace, so sweet to rest." The audience began buzzing again for the brief minutes it would take to transform the orchard scene to the friar's cell behind the opal water curtain, and still Mr. Claude Gildersleeve stood without moving, but automatically now his glance was searching the audience for something, someone. He spied her at last and strode down the aisle. His discovery of a light, the light of a new genius, had swept from his mind for the minute other considerations. Claude Gildersleeve recognized genius by a glimpse of a hem of its garment, and he acted on his glimpses instantaneously. It was thus he had discovered Victoria Gildersleeve, now his wife, and the actress he considered without her peer in the modern world. His own fame, his own greatness, was largely due to his unhesitating fidelity to his own first and independent judgments. It takes a genius to discover a genius, to discover it, that is, from just a glimpse of the hem of its royal, flowing garment. That genius was Claude Gildersleeve's. As he strode down the aisle, now on the way to proclaim his vision to the one ear he knew would appreciate it, he was the center of all eyes. He has come at last. There he is, Claude Gildersleeve, the famous producer. But he was used to such whispers following his movements. He scarcely heard or realized the increase in volume of the buzzing about him. He walked straight down the aisle, passed along in front of the water curtain, and came up to the second aisle, 3 rows to where Bianca sat, somberly, in the shadow with her friend. Hebe's face was turned away, looking into the deeper shadows of the lilacs, so she had not realized his approach, and she was left no time to warn him and recall him with a gesture as he neared her. He leaned across the people, intervening with an apology, and exclaimed with excitement, in a voice that was mellow and at the same time carried to the farthest member of the audience, "Victoria, Victoria, who is that Romeo?" Hebe stood up. Her violet cape slipped back a little from her shoulders. She was suddenly out of the shadow into the light. She made her gesture, a quick finger to her lips, but too late. Everyone had seen, everyone had heard, and now that her violet night shadowy cape had fallen quite to the ground, she stood in the radiance from the water curtain like a sister light, a paler but at the same time more luminous light. Her frock, the fallen cape disclosed, was pearly gauze. Bianca bent for the cape and wrapped it around her friend's shoulders. Mr. Gildersleeve reddened and wished with all his heart that his exclamations of "Victoria, Victoria" might fly back into his mouth and die there unsaid. But it was all useless. Everyone had heard. Everyone had seen. The two were quick to realize this, but Bianca realized it first. She spoke in Hebe's ear, and then went herself and took that vacant chair that had drawn so much attention earlier in the evening, when everyone realized it was destined for Mr. Claude Gildersleeve himself, if he should arrive in time for any part of the performance. And the great man, shrugging, impatient with what he realized was the result of his stupid, selfish blundering, slipped into the chair beside Hebe. "Don't bother," she comforted him, in a low voice. "I'd got myself into such a fix that I was meaning to explain my identity to 2 or 3 people tomorrow, and 2 or 3 knowing, everyone would have known, of course. I will tell you all about Romeo later. She is even more than you see her, more than you think. But I hope that she doesn't hear who I am till the play is done. Shh. After that, for the rest of the performance, if the truth must be told, only 4 people gave their undivided attention to the stage. Those 4 were Claude Gildersleeve, his wife Victoria, heretofore known in Fairfleet as Hebe, Bianca, and old John Hankins. But though Hebe gave her attention, she was pondering much. Between the scenes, people who through the scenes merely stole glances, frankly stared. Claude Gildersleeve was a man of middle age, his hair iron gray and very thick. His face was radiant with intellectual power, and his eyes had all the luminosity of Paul's, with keenness added. As for his features, they were chiseled and strong, and he was clean-shaven. Sitting beside slight Hebe, he appeared extraordinarily tall and broad-shouldered. His keen gaze was directed on the stage, while acting was going forward there with absorbed intentness. But whenever Romeo appeared and spoke, then the intent absorption grew until he was lost in it. Between scenes, he carried on a low-toned conversation with Hebe, his head bent so that his voice would reach her. She said little, sitting with hands clasped lightly in her lap, as though wholly unaware of the eager attention that was being bestowed on them, but in reality she was all too aware of it. Especially she was aware of Miss Grant's brilliant, amazed eyes, and Madame Coldwater's lorgnette. People wandered about and spoke to one another between the acts, while the orchestra played, but no one spoke to those two. The great producer and the great actress must indicate their willingness before anyone there would have the hardihood to approach them. Hilda, however, would have come rushing, if she could, the minute news reached the back of the stage that her father had arrived in time for the balcony scene, but she was far too busy to leave her responsibilities, even for a minute. Paul crowed when Mr. Gildersleeve's arrival was whispered to him. Hip hip hurrah! He ended his very rooster-like ejaculations, and then put his father comfortably out of mind, so that he might give the play his complete attention. The play, as it proceeded, was uneven, of course, in its presentation. It was bound to be, but the audience did not mind that. They had two plays before them now, one on the stage, one in those seats, in the shadow of the lilacs. They did not lack for entertainment. It was a very long evening, in spite of Paul's strenuous cutting of the script, but at its close the spectators seemed just as fresh and enthusiastic as they had seemed at its beginning. Needless to say, there were curtain calls to satisfy all the actors' hearts, and at the end ushers hurried up to the footlights, loaded with flowers. Old John Hankins had not had the forethought, or possibly not the sophistication, to entrust his bouquets to the ushers, and now he got out into the aisle past his niece and several others, and walking almost to the stage, tossed them toward the bowing actors himself. They were neat little bouquets, tied with string, bachelor buttons, marigolds, Johnny jump-ups, and garden forget-me-nots. Uncle John, come back here." His niece's hoarse whisper followed him, but he did not turn until he had tossed the last blossom into the magic world that tonight had opened for him. The last blossom was the faded pink from his buttonhole. Romeo, standing out above the footlights, close to Juliet. Juliet bowered in the flowers that Romeo and others had gathered from the ushers and the floor to put into her arms, looked at John Hankins and was satisfied. Intuitively, Crystal had known that his approval would be the test of a good performance. Now she accepted it as such. As for her own personal and private acting, the acting that she had offered as a gift to her friend Hebe, only Hebe could assure her as to its worth. She looked for her now. There she was, and beside her, in place of Bianca, a tall, gray-haired man gazing back at Crystal intently. He smiled at her, a peculiar, illuminated smile, and nodded emphatically. And Hebe smiled at Crystal too, her little smile that just touched the corner of her delicate lips and lighted her brow. Then the water curtain flowered on the dark for the last time, while the actors vanished from the stage. But even when it had faded, as it did in a few seconds, and the electric lights came on, the audience still sat in their places, as though waiting for something. It was only for the fraction of a second, of course, but Hebe seized it. She stood up in her place and moved out into the aisle. There she faced about and spoke, lifting her hand in a gesture for attention. But there was no need of that. Everyone's attention was hers, even old John Hankins now. "My husband, Mr. Gildersleeve," she said, "has given my secret away. I am Victoria Gildersleeve, but also I am the other things I claimed to be. I am Bianca Folgana's friend." She turned to look at her friend, but Bianca had vanished from her place. "We have been friends from my farthest memory. She was my nurse in the early days. She always had faith in me and followed me in all my fortunes. My children ordinarily call me Hebe, a name they settled on when they were very little, so that part was simple, and last summer we did this very same thing, perfectly successfully, in Santa Cruz. The reason—" Hebe lifted her head a little higher here. It had been bent rather humbly, and her first information had been given in the tone of a confession. Now she was confident, and dropped the elusive shyness that had held her. She was still elusive, but she was certain of the rightness of what she was about to utter. She was sure her reasons justified her. "As an artist, I have come to know that one must give up the things of society, and live rather as a recluse if one is to travel far on the roads of art. No compromise seems possible. If I am to have my children, know them at all well, then I cannot have friends too, except ever so few. The friends of years and of life, like Bianca. But such friends are rare. This summer I meant to have only that one friend near. Seclusion is as necessary as that. So you can understand that when my secretary blundered and let Fairfleet know that I myself was coming, I had to contradict it in some way. I did it with a telegram to your paper. That was the one falsehood. And yet it was no falsehood. I really was to be Hebe for this summer, not Victoria Gildersleeve, the actress. And now I ask you, please, to let me go on being Hebe. Fairfleet is a lovely place. We are very happy here. You have been more than good to my children. Let them go on being friends with you as they have been, and let me go on being Hebe in the complete seclusion which is demanded by my choice of work." She paused and glanced at her husband questioningly. She looked as far from a great actress in that moment as might be, much more like Crystal's Rain Sprite, or her La Belle Dame Sans Merci, Crystal's own La Belle Dame, who had all the pale glamour and none of the cruelty of Keats. Mr. Gildersleeve nodded to her, encouragement in his eyes. She finished, turning back directly upon Madame Coldwater's lorgnette and Miss Grant's brilliant, still amazed eyes. "I must thank you for very much, most of all for making the performance that we have just witnessed possible. My children have delighted in it. I think all the actors have delighted in it, and surely we, the audience, have delighted in it, haven't we?" She smiled. She vanished. Some thought that she had simply melted into the crowd, most of which were by now standing and crowding a little, the better to see her. But the more alert of observation had seen her running back into the shadow of the lilacs, and from there up on to the stage, to disappear behind the wings, and from thence they could guess into the house. In any case, she was gone. She was lost to them. She would only return for them again in her performances. She denied herself to the handful she might have known to give herself to the myriads she could never know. She slipped through the door, concealed behind the wings, into the drawing-room of the Red House. All the actors were overhead now, dressing. There was laughter up there, feet tramping, and elated voices calling from room to room. All the actors? No. One still stood against the wall beside the door. Hebe had just entered. It was Crystal in her romantic cloak. Hebe saw her by the light of the 2 tall candles burning on the piano. Hebe knew at once that she had been listening to her little speech from the window through the closed shutters. Crystal stood looking at Hebe, silent, even after Hebe had spoken her name. She seemed not to have the power to move or speak, and her eyes were fathomless. Hebe went to her and touched her shoulder. "Wake up," she said lightly. "Wake up, little friend. And, Crystal, you did marvelously. I like your Romeo." Still, Crystal was speechless, her eyes dark pools. Hebe laughed softly. "I want you to go out and get Selina, and ask her to stay to supper," she said quickly. "We are going to have a celebration tonight, this family, and of course we must have you. Where is Paul? I want to congratulate the fellow. Oh, Crystal, I'm so proud and delighted with his work, his and Hilda's and yours. I am happy in spite of being found out for the first time in my life, in spite of having been a bad actor." Still, the dark-eyed Romeo was dumb. Victoria Gildersleeve put her hands on either side the girl's cheeks, and pulling her head to her, kissed her on her roughed lips. "Go get your sister," she commanded. And then from Crystal's vision the sprite vanished into the glare of the lights in the big hall as she went to congratulate her son. There was no hurry about finding Selina. Crystal knew, as well as she could know anything in this period of dazedness, that Selina would be waiting for her by this time in the Star's dressing room. She herself must lean against the wall a few minutes longer, in the quiet and shadow of the candle-lighted room. When she felt that she could move and breathe again, she bent to the floor where she had dropped her flowers and filled her arms with them. There were roses and carnations and orchids and violets and a bunch of wild flowers. The wild flowers were from Madame Coldwater's garden, she decided, and the violets, she guessed, from Alexander. Her name was scrawled on their card in black characters that looked as though they ought to have been transcribed by that young artist. When the cast had made their bows to the applauding audience, Crystal had picked up old John Hankin's faded pink from the stage floor. It was crushed in her cold hand now. There was a stalk of fireweed, tagged with her initials. Some day she might learn that to be Dr. Grant's whimsy. At this minute it meant nothing to her. She gathered it in with the rest. To mount the stairs to Selina and the Star's dressing room, she had to pass the dining room door. She looked in and saw the long table aglow with a double line of wax candles, and places set for a meal. Bianca was standing at the other side of the table, surveying the effect with a shadowy smile. Crystal crept in to her. "Bianca, Bianca," she said in a whisper, "did you know that Hebe has asked Selina and me to stay for supper? Let's put these flowers on the table somehow. Have you vases?" Bianca was less somber than usual. There was a deep, far, but quite distinguishable glow in her strange eyes for Hebe's young friend. She took the flowers from Crystal. "Yes, Hebe told me this morning that you would be here for supper after the performance, you and Miss Selina." Then of the flowers she said, "Let us put them so, no bowls, no vases, so and so for celebration." With clever fingers she arranged the flowers, blue, gold, pink, purple, over the board. They lay on the plates and the white napkins, and all up and down the table, as though they had drifted there of themselves on a light wind. Chapter 24. She's a Young Thing. The next day was Sunday. In spite of the late hours kept by most of the congregation the night before, the village church was as near full as it ever became, not excepting feast days. The Gildersleeve family, very naturally, was the center of concentrated attention before the service. Victoria Gildersleeve was there, as she had been every other Sunday this summer, only today she and Bianca had moved forward to sit with Mr. Gildersleeve and Hilda. Claude Gildersleeve occupied the end of the pew, sitting next to his daughter Hilda. Then came Bianca, then the great actress. Paul, of course, was kept at home by his ankle. He wore her usual white dress with long sleeves, tied at the wrist with pearly bows, and the wide silvery hat shaded her face. Only in church it did not lend the pallor it affected out of doors. She was under a rose window, and the light streaming through the stained glass touched her features to unusual life. She sat with her hands lightly folded in her lap, her face lifted and listening, as she had sat all the other Sundays. Nothing had changed in Hebe, and they had had her here like this in their vision numbers of times before, and never dreamed. With one accord they acknowledged themselves very dull. She was so rare, so fine, so exquisite. How could they have failed to guess? She sat still, as though she did not know she was the center of all their thoughts. She sat so still, her face lifted, the light from the rose window lending her its own transfused radiance, that they became still too, those curious gazers. Gradually they assumed Hebe's attitude. Hebe was in church. They were in church. It was church that mattered. A deep voice was reading, "Whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, if there be any virtue, any praise, think on these things." Crystal's eyes met Alexander's across the church. It was as though they had been thinking the same thoughts, and now turned to say, "Yes, it is like that," to each other. But Crystal looked away quickly, the memory of her humiliating tears obtruding itself on that instant of telepathy. After the service, the minute Crystal was outside on the sidewalk, she was seized from several directions. But Agnes, having reached her first, had a prior claim, and it was to her Crystal gave her attention. "Oh, you clever, clever, clever thing. How did you ever guess, though? Did you know it that day at the train? Mother says you must have. And that's why you gave her the larkspurs. But how did you know? And why, oh why, did you keep it to yourself and not tell us?" Crystal was dazed a bit by the vehemence of all this, but she found her answers. "I didn't know. I only knew that she was wonderful. Anyone could see that who cared to look. But I didn't know she was Victoria Gildersleeve. How could I know that, any more than you?" Agnes looked skeptical, but she squeezed Crystal's arm, which she was already holding, more tensely, and whispered, "Shh, here she comes." Every one was whispering that. She came down the steps, with her husband and daughter and Bianca, her head bent, listening to Claude Gildersleeve's low-toned remarks. They walked away together, an apparently unconscious and certainly a united group. At least, if any of them had been self-conscious, it was only Hilda. As she passed Crystal and the circle of girls around her, she gave the little band a slightly defiant nod. Her freckles dimmed in a wave of color. Imagine blushing because everyone is staring at your mother, staring simply because she is one of the most famous people in the world, and the most beautiful and lovely. Agnes could not understand it, but Crystal understood. She wanted to run after Hilda and give her a big hug. She suddenly saw that Hilda was the goat, honest, blunt, boyish, loyal Hilda. With Paul, nothing in the situation would matter. He was too much absorbed in his own life, his own artistic impulses and enthusiasms, to care a bit whether Fairfleet knew who he was or not. But Hilda had resented all the slights and criticisms directed toward her idolized mother when she was only Hebe. And now she resented just as much the obvious adulation, since she knew it was the last thing in the world her mother wanted or could find a place for in her life. Crystal was not the kind of girl who bestows hugs easily, but in spirit she was running after jolly, nice Hilda and hugging her at this minute. Selina and Madame Coldwater and Alexander were slowly descending the church steps now, listening to Miss Grant, who was holding forth vivaciously in their midst. When Alexander's eyes lighted on Crystal, however, he went straight to her, and spoke over the heads of her friends. "What do you say that we start on walking?" he inquired. "Grandmother and Selina are going in the car, and then it can come back and pick us up." Crystal and Selina were dining at Blue Diamond. Ordinarily, Crystal would have liked nothing better than a walk after 2 hours in church, but her humiliation over those tears was still very keen. She nodded agreement with Alexander's suggestion, more because she was too shy to find words to object than that she welcomed the idea of a tete-a-tete with him. So they started off together. Alexander felt the constraint in her, and it bothered him. He probed for the reason at once. "What's the matter, anyway?" he asked. "Last night you fought shy of me successfully at every turn. I wanted, like anything, to congratulate you on your performance, and you were simply not there, ever. What is it, please?" "I suppose I am ashamed." "Ashamed? You? Hickory-crickory." This was adopted from Hilda's vocabulary. "Why?" "The way I cried. I have hated seeing you ever since." Alexander's smoky blue eyes seemed to grow suddenly clear in his distress. They had passed Tingle Bell and were well beyond the village before he spoke again. But in that time of silence he had reasoned himself into a certain degree of understanding of Crystal. "It's all right about your crying," he said finally. "I hate crying. You do too. It's disgusting. But you had a big reason for crying. That makes it different. And instead of it making me hate seeing you again, it has given me a feeling of being something like a big brother to you. I don't want you to cry, and I don't like the way you cry. It's not pretty. But if you ever have to cry again, I'd cross the world to see you through it." "Speaking of the world, are you going around it with your friend Victoria this fall?" "Yes. How did you know?" "They asked me last night. Can you believe that anything so wonderful has really happened? Selina is as joyful as I am about it. She doesn't mind a bit, you see, because she trusts Hebe." "Trust Hebe? I should say so. Alexander, things now make me see that you knew all the time who she was, from the very first, almost. How did you know?" Alexander laughed. "Well, I'd be a pretty bad artist if I hadn't recognized her here after having seen her some dozen times on the stage. And no one else in all the world is so graceful as Victoria. I knew her when she lifted her arms to take off her hat, or a minute after, that first morning on the view. I was dead certain when she walked over to the white birch clump through the flowery grass. She walked like nothing human, like a fairy." "Yes, didn't she though? Like a fairy. I was thinking it too." You, Crystal, were a clever little girl. That is what Agnes just said, that I was clever. Oh well, I don't mean it as Agnes means it. In fact, I don't mean clever at all. I mean wise. You were dull enough about part of it, not guessing it yourself, even after Hebe knew all of Romeo's part and wouldn't talk about Victoria Gildersleeve and everything. In fact, You were so dull that I am not at all sure you deserve the reward of this great opportunity that's come to you, this amazing opportunity." Crystal looked up at him quickly, troubled, but she saw at once that he was not serious. He went on, "When you are great and famous, Crystal, take my advice, and interviewers stand knee-deep on your doorstep. Don't tell them how it all happened, your entrance into the theatrical life. They'd print it in their papers, and then misguided young things the world over would be expecting like wonders to fall from the sky on their heads. You must realize that your case is miraculous. Take a leaf from Hebe's book and remain silent when they ask for the story of your early beginnings." Crystal did not laugh with him. She put her hand on his arm as they walked and suddenly said, "I have been thinking about all that myself, or rather something like it. I have been thinking that it didn't fall from the sky really, this going around the world with Hebe. It grew from a seed. It looks as though it fell from the sky, because you can only see the tree. You never saw the seed. You speak in parables. What was the seed?" Crystal took off her flower-wreathed hat and fanned her hot cheeks. Alexander propelled ahead by a quick succession of thoughts and emotions, was striding, and Crystal, in her docile, unquestioning way, was endeavoring to keep pace. "I think the seed was my love for Hebe," she said. "It grew, and it grew, and it flowered, treed, rather, into what has happened to me. I am going to understudy, and have walk-on parts, and work at languages, and by I am going to be an actress. But none of it, not any of it, would have come true if I hadn't loved Hebe." "Yes, but what about Hebe's loving you, her friendship? It looks mightily to me as though that had played some part. You're not leaving that out." Crystal laughed at the idea of her leaving that out, but she tried to be clearer. "Yet I didn't do Romeo with all my heart that way last night because Hebe was my friend. I did it because I was her friend. I offered my acting to her secretly, in my own mind. I was frightened, stage-struck. I was just scared to death by the idea that Mr. Gildersleeve might come and sit in that empty chair that was waiting for him, and by old John Hankins, with his hands on his knees out there. I could never have uttered a sound, I do believe, if I hadn't found Hebe in the audience too. When I found her, I got the idea of offering whatever I could do with Romeo's part to her, a gift like the larkspurs. That changed everything. Do you understand?" "I understand that you have hit on very good advice for lovers," Alexander responded, after a minute's silence. "Your idea is a new one to me, Crystal, but it sounds an ideal one, and a good recipe for success in any line of work, too. Lovers. Oh, Alexander, I have tried not to think it since we discovered last night that Hebe was Victoria, but I have been praying that you didn't fall in love with her before you knew she was Victoria and was married." Crystal's voice was strained. Only her affection for Alexander had forced her to confide her anxiety for him. but he reassured her instantly, seriously. "No, you forget that I recognized her for who she was, almost at once. But even if I hadn't, she would never in the world have allowed me to fall in love with her. She is too beautiful to let anyone do that. Remember the white dragon." Crystal sighed relief, but she was confused by his next sentences. "And you too, Crystal. You are well on the way to becoming a white dragon on your own account. But before you vanish quite into the light, stay long enough for me to get your image fixed indelibly in memory. Then some day, looking at the image, I may dare approach the light with an offering of my own, like your offering to Hebe last night, only more of a one. It will be an offering of my life's work in fact, all of it, past and to be, not just my first attempt." There had been a unique understanding between Crystal and Alexander from the very first hour of their friendship. The friendship was as alive as ever in this minute, but the understanding had waned. He realized this as he slowed his steps at last in consideration of her, and to get back to the old, simple footing he began to whistle, but he grinned to himself mentally when after a bar or so he woke to the fact that his tune was that of the folk song that goes, "Can she make a cherry pie, Billy boy, Billy boy? Can she make a cherry pie, charming Billy? She can make a cherry pie, quick's a cat can wink her eye, but she's a young thing, and cannot leave her mother." "There's the car coming back for us," he exclaimed, breaking his tune off sharp in the middle. It certainly was speedy, but none too speedy, he added to himself, as the plum-colored chariot turned about and drew up beside them. More than anything else in the world, just then, Alexander Coldwater wanted to keep Crystal's friendship and trust. If he had done anything to endanger it with that impetuous outburst a minute ago, he would be desolate. His anxiety, however, was unwarranted. Crystal might have a genius for acting. She was to have her opportunity to prove whether she had or not in the next few years. But that she had a genius for friendship was already a certainty.